Hello and welcome to the second part of Nick Stewart's webinar on Introduced Aquatic Plants. The first part is also available on the BSBI YouTube channel and covers plants with spiky rosettes as well as stringy, feathery and strappy leaves. This is the second part and it will look at plants with floating leaves.
So we'll come to probably the biggest group and quite a mixed bag of things. The group of species with floating leaves. And we'll start with the larger ones, the water lilies and related, well, not related, but sort of similar, quite large leaves that float on the water surface. Now, there is a variation of the yellow water lily, which has been introduced in a few places. It's called spatterdock. Instead of having the leaves flat on the surface, most of the leaves were sticking up out of the water. Now, you do have to be a bit careful because the yellow water lily, if it's in a dense patch like this, and the water level drops, the leaves will often stick up out of the water. So don't immediately jump to the fact that it might be the spatterdock. But if you see a lot of leaves sticking up out of the water like this, it's definitely worth checking a bit closer. And Richard Lansdowne has actually looked at quite a lot of the sites for this, and has found that there's only one population that he actually reckons is the true spatterdock, Nufa advena, and actually a lot of them are hybrids with the yellow water lily. So the difference is, if you see a population with a lot of leaves sticking out of the water, have a look at the fruit shape. You'll see that whereas the common yellow water lily has quite a narrow neck to the fruits, this is much more sort of vase shaped, with a sort of a much broader neck to it. And another easy difference to separate them is that the petiole, the leaf stalk, is circular in cross section, whereas in the yellow water lily, it has a sort of rounded triangular cross section. There are differences in the anthers. The anthers in advena are longer than the filaments. And apparently usually has 6 sepals, whereas the yellow water lily normally has 5 sepals. And this reddish color sometimes appears, whereas I don't think I've seen a yellow water lily with this color. The hybrid is not hugely different, but there are differences in the anthers that they don't, because it's a hybrid, they don't hiss properly, and the anthers are much more equal in size to the filaments. It's quite a rare. There are only a few places that, and it's patches that have been planted, and it's not sort of anything that really takes over, but you get quite a solid patch where you get it. The fringe water lily is much more of a problem though. So this is has these yellow flowers with these fringed edges to the petals. It's actually related to the bogbean rather than other water lilies. So the flowers are very distinctive. They're different structurally, very different from the other water lilies. The leaves are quite a bit smaller than the yellow and white water lilies. You'll see that the underside is covered with these little dots all over the surface, which is a good distinguishing character. But the leaves tend to have this rather sort of wavy edge rather than a complete circle, or ellipse for for the leaf shape. And it actually, rather than are all arising from the base, the yellow and the white water lilies have a tuber and send up leaves directly from that tuber. This one will have a stem and which will branch, and you'll get several flowers coming from the same point. It's quite a problem in some areas. It's can take over. Looking at a site earlier this year where it's just a serious problem and it's just taken over the whole zone where the other plants will be growing in the sort of shallows. So I think I've covered all that. The venation, venation can help separate between the white and yellow water lilies, and the venation is quite similar to the white water lily in terms of most of the veins radiate from this point of where the leaf attaches to this to where the to the stalk, and as it gets it's not very clear in here, but as you get towards the edge, they begin to join up again and form a network. Whereas in the yellow water, the true yellow water lilies, the veins split off all the way up the sort of midrib, and they remain parallel. They fork, but they never actually meet up at the edges. So in terms of the venation, it's more similar to the yellow to the white water lily, but usually these dots on the surface are very distinctive. In contrast to the yellow water lilies, the white water lilies, so the nymphaeas, are a much more complicated group when it comes to introductions. In about the 1880s, a French botanist called Marliac managed to hybridize the white water lily with a number of tropical species. And since then, there have been a number of cultivars developed from those hybrids. He unfortunately didn't tell, or maybe fortunately, didn't tell people how he did it. So there are not a huge number of cultivars of the water lilies. But there are probably about sort of 200 or so. But actually, probably in the wild, the ones that get planted out in well, a lot of the cultivars are designed or optimal in little tubs and garden ponds and small water bodies like that. And there are only a few that are able to cope with more open conditions and deeper water. So there probably are only about a dozen or so cultivars that you will come across on any sort of regular basis. But the things to look out for. So this is a typical white water lily, our native one. It has sort of quite delicate flowers. Leaves tend to be flat to the surface. They don't tend to be all that dense. Whereas often the cultivars form really dense patches with sort of leaves pushing each other out of the water. They often form quite discrete patches. So these are the usual clues that they're not the true native variety. And I mean, there is an aggregate term for the hybrids. I mean, they can be recorded as just nymphaea cultivars, or the aggregate name is Marliaceae. But it's probably I've never had the time to properly look at which varieties are established in the wild in Ireland and Britain. But as I say, I think there are probably only quite a rather small number. And often another giveaway, of course, is that they're not truly white. They often have pinks or yellowish colours in them, and if you start seeing those, you know that they're not the true native variations. But there are white ones, and those can be a little bit uncertain as to whether they're introduced. But generally, the way they're growing, the size of the leaves, um, uh, uh, usually are a giveaway. There is this is probably the most common yellowish one, which is Lymphea malleata chromatella. Um, uh, an old cultivar. It's been around since, I mean, it was Marliak that created it. And is quite distinctive in that it has these streaks on the leaves. And that one seems to be quite an easy one to identify. But the other ones, there are a number of characters that are used to look out for. Flower color I've just discussed. The shape of the flower can be is quite different. This one's quite a sort of bowl-shaped ones, but there are ones with much longer petals that look more star-shaped. The wideness of this basal split is quite a useful character. Some of them, they tend to turn up at the edges. There, you'll see here at the bottom of the lobes that there's a little sort of point. That's quite a useful character for separating them, the different cultivars. Color of the underside of the leaf is useful. You see this one's a much more starry shaped flower. There are some that have fuzzy hairs all the way down the petals and the flower stalks. And there are some that have spots on the surfaces. So there are a number of quite good characters, but it's just sometime if when I have some time, may get a chance to work out, because I suspect that there, as I say, there are probably rather few variations around the place. So other ones with floating leaves. I've included this because in a number of places, although it's native, it's generally regarded as native in Ireland and in certainly southern Britain. It is regarded as an introduction in some places, but it's a very easy one to identify. It has sort of much smaller leaves than the water lilies, quite circular with these rounded lobes. And you'll see this venation is very distinctive. It's sort of so you've got the midrib, and then you've got this side, the main side veins sort of curl up, sort of on either side, sort of more or less parallel to the edges, but sort of converging at the leaf tip. There aren't, I haven't seen similar venation in any of the other ones. It is a free floating plant, and with dangling roots, it doesn't root at the bottom. It has these nice white flowers. Oh yeah, just to show you, there are, particularly up in Scotland, it's regarded as an introduction. And it's quite often sold in garden centres, so it appears in ponds, which people have put things in, and so it's spread more widely than it would probably naturally be. But you can sort of see these clusters tend to be in where there's big ditch systems, and it's sort of well established in some rich ditch systems as a native plant. But so it sometimes gets introduced. Now, this is another of the serious problem species. This is the floating pennywort. Unlike the common pennywort, our native common pennywort, it has this incision up to the leaf stalk. So the leaf stalk would be here, whereas in our native pennywort, we would have a round leaf with the stalk coming up into the middle. So it has a sort of lobed leaf, um, uh, and um, and it has this basal split. The main thing that you could confuse it with is the celery leaf buttercup. And you'll see that sometimes those leaves are quite similar. They're quite glossy, like the floating pennywort. Um, but you'll see that the basal split is quite a wide gape. Uh, uh, and it's actually more strongly lobed. But also the actual plant is a sort of single rosette, and it will grow upwards from this rosette. If I go back to this will produces stolons through the water, and it will very quickly form quite big mats floating out over the water surface. And if you sort of pull that, you'll find that it's only attached in a few places, or often it will only be attached in the bank, and it will float out and sort of spread out as rafts into the more open water. Serious problems in some waterways in Britain. Fortunately, less of it in Ireland at the moment, but it's still something to keep an eye out for. Um, this is rather a weird flowered thing. This is called Cape pondweed or water hawthorn. Um, uh, when it's flowering, there's not much that you're going to confuse it with. The leaves could look a bit like Potamogeton natans, so we're into ones that don't have the sort of lobe teeth like the lobes like the water lilies. So this is a complete oval leaf, quite similar to a Potamogeton natans, a common pondweed leaf. Difference is that the common pondweed will have just at the top of the stem, it will have a discolored flexible bit of stem which allows the leaf to be placed wherever fits best on the water surface. The other thing is that the pondweeds, they have an obvious stem with alternate leaves, whereas the Cape pondweed, the leaves all arise from a tuber at the base. So this leaf, the stalk will go all the way down to the bottom of the pond. Yeah, not a common plant, but it is established in a few places in both Britain and Ireland, and so you'll come across it occasionally, but it's not an aggressive thing. It will just quietly sit and slightly expand its patch over time. Come back to the floating water plantain. We've dealt with this in some detail earlier, but when it gets to the surface, it produces a little floating leaf, quite a small floating leaf, about sort of a couple of centimeters typically, and it has these little white flowers that like the three petals, as in most of the Elismataceae. But it should also have these underwater leaves that I was discussing earlier. Now I put this in because this is what you're most likely to. Perhaps I'll jump to the next picture. There are a couple of species of Ludwigia called water primroses, and they produce these very striking yellow flowers, very pretty flowers, um, and less so in Britain and Ireland. But if you go quite near continental Europe, it is quite a serious pest. It's can form very extensive colonies. It could well become more of a problem with global warming in Britain. So it's something that we might see more and more of, and might become more and more of a problem. I put it in next to the amphibious bistorte because, like the amphibious bistorte, it differs from a lot of the other sort of ones with floating leaves in having a herringbone venation. So a lot of the pondweeds have parallel veins that sort of run all the length of the leaf, whereas this has the sort of herringbone arrangement. Also, like the amphibious bistorte, it has an aquatic free floating form with floating leaves, and then if it comes onto the land, it produces a terrestrial upright plant, and so there is quite a possibility of confusion with or overlooked because, of course, we're much more familiar with the amphibious bistorte, but you do need to keep an eye out for this water primrose. Doesn't have the sheathing base. If I go back here, you've got this sheathing base at the base of the leaf of the amphibious bistorte, whereas that's lacking in the water primrose. The taxonomy, there are supposed to be 2 species involved. Taxonomy is a little bit uncertain, but the differences in the size of the petals and sepals and the shape of the stipules. But probably the best thing is if you start finding these the very good descriptions in the aquatic plants of Northwest Europe. But it is something to be concerned about, and as I say, it is sometimes sold in garden centres under a different name. There's 2 rather strange floating things that you might come across: the water hyacinth and water lettuce. They're sold in garden centres. I don't think either of them are frost hardy. So what tends to happen is that they escape and can get quite abundant during a season, but come the winter they tend to be killed off. So they don't tend to persist, but you can find some quite sort of well-established patches of it in places that have escaped from a garden or whatever. Somebody's put them in a pond and they've escaped. So just worth being aware of, but fortunately not a problem. Of course, water hyacinth is quite a serious problem in tropical areas, but not yet anyway in Britain or Ireland. So the next group are the again floating species, but we're talking about little floating things, free floating plants. And the first in this group is the water fern, a very distinctive looking thing with these very sort of scale-like leaves. It is a fern, it is a pteridophyte, and it can become very abundant in some places. It is, I think, frost sensitive, so it will be knocked back by cold winters. But it can be quite a problem. It's used in tropical places in rice fields as a fertilizer because it can actually fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere. So when the rice paddies dry out, they will just rot away, and they will act as a green fertilizer for the rice. Um, uh, if they occur, I mean, you can get some quite substantial patches in Britain and Ireland. Although I tend to think that if you get large quantities of it, it's because there are problems with nutrients. So it does like nutrient-rich conditions, and that's when it does gets at its most abundant. It's something to be aware of. There is another water fern in Europe, in a few places. It's not yet been recorded in Ireland or Britain, but it's just something that's worth being aware of, that there is another one, and it's worth looking out for. It differs in having smaller leaves, and the hairs on the leaves are different structurally, and the macrospores of the common water fern have warts over the surface, whereas this one doesn't. So just keep an eye out occasionally if you find a smaller lead version of water fern, that it could be this. Now, this is quite a big group of things that have arrived in various places. So the duckweeds get around very easily, and most garden centres you will find a number of different ones growing in amongst the trays. So I'll go into a bit more detail of how you would spot these. So the first one is I think a wolfia. It's not yet been found in Ireland, but it occurs in a number of places in Britain. And in some areas it's actually quite common. It's a tiny little thing. It's about 0.5 millimeter or a millimeter in diameter, and it's just a little round ball. Best way of actually finding it is by picking up a batch of duckweed and just rubbing it between your fingers, and it will feel like bits of grit, whereas the common duckweeds, most of the other duckweeds are like scale-like, and they will sort of slip over each other. Excuse me a second. Now, for a long time, we've been calling this Wolfia ariza, and it was thought to be native. But in recent years, particularly people like Fred Rumsey and Rich Lansdowne have been looking at this, and it turns out that most of the plant that occurs in Britain is a thing called Wolfia columbiana, and it's probably an introduction in the 19th century. And that actually ariza may or may not occur. It's actually, if it does occur, it's extremely rare. And the thing to look out for is basically the shape. So Wolfia ariza has a sort of flat top to it, and is widest. So it's like a hemisphere, a bit like a miniature lemna gibber. It's like a hemisphere, whereas the sort of flat bit at the top of the other two species it is smaller, so that you can actually see the bottom of the iceberg, as it were, around the sides of what's sticking up out of the surface. And so Columbia and Globosa are differ in their shape. Globosa has a much longer frond, whereas Columbiana is quite a sort of circular frond. But as far as we can establish, Columbiana is the common one. Say, whereas Oryza may or may not be present, and globosa seems to be extremely rare. It's only turned up in one or two places. So that's quite recently, these discoveries by, say, Richard Lansdowne and Fred Rumsey have been doing quite a bit of work on this. Now, the largest of our native duckweeds is the great duckweed, Spirulina polyriza. And its most distinctive thing is that it has multiple roots coming out of the bottom of the of the frond, and it has this purple color underneath the water. It's also much the biggest of a duckweed, so it's usually quite obvious to see when you see a patch of duckweed, obviously bigger in size. Excuse me. However, there are another two Spirulina species. They're similar in having purple underneath and having multiple roots, but they're much smaller in size. So they're much more the same size as the common duckweed, Lemna minor. And mostly they're still in horticultural situations, but they may appear in the wild. They're quite difficult to separate. You have to look at the structure at the base of the roots emerging from the frond to definitely separate them. But so I would probably the best thing is to refer you to the aquatic plants of Northwest Europe for the detail. But the thing is to keep an eye out for multi-rooted plants with purple underneath that are much smaller than. So this is Polyriza, our native one, and these are this one's punctata. Um, and the only place I've seen this is actually in the Botanic Gardens in Bangor in North Wales, where it's actually well established in a number of the ponds. And I don't know if it's yet properly established in the wild. Much the most common of the introduced duckweeds is Lemna minuta, which is a very small fronded one. And really the best way of actually spotting Lemna minuta is by looking at a mass of duckweeds. And you'll see dotted through here, there are a few larger ones with rather sort of glossier surface to them. So that's the common duckweed. This is Lemna minor. And you can see that this is obviously a smaller duckweed. And also it's quite a lot more translucent. It's not quite so thick and glossy as Lemna minor. So it tends to look a bit grayer, but you definitely you can see a pattern that it's definitely a sort of smaller. And often the question is, how do you know it's just not baby Lemna minor? The thing is that Lemna minor, well, all the duckweeds, they bud off from each other. So the baby ones are usually still attached to the larger fronds. So the fact that these are consistently separated and shows that it's actually a smaller growing species. Which is why it's actually usually better to identify duckweeds in the field, because as soon as you sort of collect a sample, they will start breaking up, and you will actually get little leaves. These little leaves of the baby lemna minors will start breaking off the bigger species, and it becomes a lot more difficult. But if you look at them in the wild, that's usually quite easy to see, um, that there is this definite size difference, and as I say, also in the glossiness of the leaf. One thing to notice, though, is that it's always green, um, whereas some of the other ones. So if you see a Lemna minuta sized plant that's got red colours in it, then you need to start thinking about some of the other possibilities. And Lemna chirionifera is quite a recently identified uh, uh, species, but it's probably been around and just overlooked. Um, and the one time that I've seen it, it showed up because of this color difference. It looked like minuta, but it was the wrong color. And if you can see underneath, the red color tends to start at the root, and it spreads outwards and eventually covers the majority of the underside of the frond. There are little papillae on the upper surface, which are also a character of it. And there is another very small duckweed, sort of the minuta size, called Lemna valdiviana, um, and looks quite similar to Lemna minuta, um, and is similarly quite pale green and a little bit translucent. The key diagnostic character is the length of this midrib vein, which is quite long in this one. But the other distinctive thing that will often pick it up is that the fronds are usually asymmetric, so they're not sort of a neat ellipsoid. You can see this is sort of wider on this side than it is on this side. And they're very often in groups of four, and look a bit butterfly-like. Very typical. You can sort of see it in a group here. You can see that they look a little bit like butterflies, flat on the water. Um, both of these small species are being picked up more and more frequently in both Britain and Ireland. So it is worth keeping an eye out for these, because they may start appearing more or less anywhere. And they could well be coming from garden centres. As I say, they're often, you can find them growing in garden centre, sort of in amongst the water plants. So just to show you that, let's say the best way is to look at duckweeds in a mass in situ, and often you can tell the difference much more easily than if you sort of grab a sample and take it home. So we have a nice little mixture. There's ivy duckweed, so the native, and fat duckweed, Lemna gibber, and Lemna minor, and we've got some Lemna minuta in here. And this is the pinkish one down here, Lemna chirionifera. And the problem is that duckweeds get around very quickly. They're easily carried by birds or people. So the chances of other ones appearing is reasonably high. So it's well worth sort of just keeping an eye on what duckweeds are appearing. So just as a sort of final group, we've got some species with sort of submerged to coming out of the water, but with opaque leaves. So and the main one in this group is the thing called Hampshire purslane, which is a native plant, particularly around the New Forest in England, but has started appearing in a few other places, and it's probably introductions that have escaped from people's gardens and the like. And it's oh sorry. It usually has these red stems and it has these opposite leaves, and it's got tiny little greenish flowers with 4 sepals. So it's actually related to the water primroses that I was talking about earlier, but looks very different, and structurally the flowers are quite different. The water primroses have 5 petals and sepals, whereas the Hampshire purslane has 4 sepals. I've also sort of come back to the swamp stonecrop again, because this is how you most commonly see it, forming these masses which are sort of part in the water and part coming out onto the land. But I've again, just to iterate that they've got these paired opposite leaves with pointed tips, and quite sort of fleshy structure to them. A few other things that you might come across with their feet in the water. Uh, I won't go into a lot of detail of the characters of these, but uh, just to have a sort of reference of the what you might come across. They're usually planted as ornamental things in ponds. There's the bog arum, Cala palustris. Um, um, Another Araceae called Golden Club. Very certainly when these are flowering, they're fairly unmistakable things, but um, I'm less familiar with the foliage. So if I just had a patch of that foliage, I'd probably be scratching my head a bit. Another one that come across quite occasionally is a thing called pickerel weed, Pontederia cordata. Um, this is actually one of a group of things that um, uh, turned up in a few places in County Cork, and the great Maurice Scannell reckoned that there was actually a Canadian engineer that went around parts of Cork planting some of these exotic things that he was familiar with from home. And you can find 1 or 2 of these in really rather obscure places in the middle of a bog. But you will come across this planted occasionally on ponds. The only thing that might, if you saw the foliage of that, that's quite similar is the sort of basal leaves of greater spearwort, Ranunculus lingua, can have a sort of similar oval shaped leaf like that. Um, but when it's flowering, of course, it's a very distinctive looking thing. Now, there are a number of arrowheads that have been introduced in different places. So we've got the native arrowhead, um, which is quite widespread, particularly in England and parts of Ireland. But there are a number of other species that have been introduced. Probably the most frequent one is Sagittaria latifolia, which has much wider leaves and doesn't have that purplish colour in the flowers, and the flowers are stalked. But there are other ones. This is another one. This is actually another one that was attributed to this Canadian engineer, Sagittaria graminia, which instead of having sort of an obvious aristate leaf, has a sort of long lanceolate leaf. and could easily be confused with a water plantain. I would guess. Um, Now, these Sagittarius are difficult. The taxonomy is quite confused even in their native ranges. Um, and it's one that Richard Lansdowne is working on to try and see if he can pick out what we have in Britain and even just to work out how the taxonomy works. Um, Important characters that seem to be important are the leaf shape, whether they're sort of lanceolate leaves or arrow-shaped leaves. Whether the flowers are stalked or sessile, so this one you can see the flowers and the fruits are stuck on the stem. Purple coloration at the base of the leaf. Fertility, whether their anthers are producing pollen or not. And so if you find any interesting ones, I think Richard Lansdowne would be very interested to see specimens of it or photographs of it. Uh, and because he's trying to get the bottom of which is what in this group. Another quite frequent introduction is the sweet flag, which has leaves a bit like iris does, with these sort of flat, short, sword-shaped leaves. Um, Distinctive thing is you'll see the midrib is off center. It's not in the middle of the leaf, but very common is this crinkly edges you can see there. That's usually the earliest giveaways. If you see an iris with these sort of crinkly leaves like that, it's worth looking at a little bit closer to see if it's sweet flag. It tends to be a color difference tends to be a yellow or green color as well, rather than the grey green of the common flag iris. Another quite widely separated planted species is the flowering rush, and that is a native in parts of England, but in Ireland, I think it's regarded as probably always, and Scotland too, is probably always as an introduction. It's an emergent species, but you will find the leaves, particularly in rivers, you'll find the rivers grow just sort of swept over it and growing as sort of ribbon-like leaves under the water. Distinctive thing, it's got very pointed leaves, which are often twisted. And it's got this sort of rather spongy triangular cross section. And if you break it carefully, it has the little fine threads, uh, and so just pull it apart gently. You can see the little sort of gossamer-like strands between the break. Obviously, when you pull it further apart, but those will break. But just sort of, if you just keep the two ends quite close, you'll see these little threads joining the two. I could go a lot further onto the land, but I think probably that's time to stop. That's just to show the distribution of the flowering rush, and you can see very common in England, but pretty widely planted around elsewhere. But I think it's regarded as an introduced plant in Ireland and Scotland.
Well, thank you, Nick. Um, oh, sorry.
Oh no!
Uh,
I'd forgotten that I'd actually put it just as a quick sort of resume at the end. There are a lot of the species that we've been talking about are quite benign. They'll sit there where they've been planted quite happily, just ticking over as a patch. But I would this is just a quick list of the problem species, and the I've divided it into two groups because this group here are ones that just seem to be able to spread on their own, whether it's fragments carried by birds or whatever, and once established, there's not a lot that can be done about them. Uh, this group here tend to be uh, where they're placed, so they tend to be deliberately introduced to sites. But when they are introduced, they just take over and are really aggressive things. And there is a bit more hope in containing them, but it is an uphill battle in most cases, trying to control. Once one of these species has got well established, it's an uphill struggle to control them. Okay, sorry, I forgot about that last slide.
There we go. So thank you, Nick. That was fascinating and really quite a marathon. And it sounds like you've more or less worn out your voice as it is. So I don't think we're going to do a lot of questions. So, but one thing I thought I'd ask was, um, is there one particular book or resources? I know there's a lot of resources on the Aquatic Plant Project website, which you can find on the BSBI website. Is there anything else? I mean, actually, I was surprised. I bet some of these plants I am familiar with, but I didn't really know they were introduced. I suppose they're not very aggressive and
I think that's it. I mean, some of them are quite happy just sort of sitting there. Probably the best books are Joe Caffrey's book on the photographic book on aquatic plants has a lot of these introduced species in there. Um, but probably even better is the um, aquatic plants of Northwest Europe.
oh
Uh,
yes,
uh,
that's quite a new one, which is very, very big and quite hefty, isn't
yeah,
it?
it's not exactly a field handbook, but it has all the details. So some of these more difficult ones, it will have the key characters in quite a
So
lot of detail with
so
pictures.
if you're getting into it seriously, that's the book to have at home to check things off against.
Yeah,
Anyway, I think we've kept these people long enough, Nick. It's past 9 o'clock.
gosh,
And so thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you to the audience for putting up with us.